Daylight settled over the first island landfalls as canoes and caravels shared the same blue water. Taíno communities met the newcomers with cassava, bread, fish, and water, guiding them towards safe inlets and calm beaches. Leaders expected reciprocity and clear boundaries around gardens, fishing grounds, and ceremonial spaces. At first, exchanges felt simple: small bells and cloth for food, parrots for trinkets, directions along reefs for metal tools. Maybe you're watching this while having breakfast, or lying in bed after a long day, wondering how this first meeting could change the world. Wherever you are right now, imagine standing on that shore, seeing sails for the first time, not knowing they carry a storm of conquest. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want to keep uncovering these hidden moments of history. The tone changed when Spaniards asked for gold, labour and obedience to a faith they explained through signs, prayers and threats. Captives taken aboard ships did not return. Demands for porters and canoe crews increased. Punishments followed refusals. Missionaries accompanied soldiers and interpreters, pressing for baptisms and new names. Families who had offered shelter learned that guest and commander were becoming the same figure. Communities began limiting visits, moving stores inland, and posting watchers along headlands during the day. Warnings passed between villages about forced work and sudden seizures. Some chiefs ended trade entirely, others permitted only brief supervised meetings. Across the Caribbean, the welcome narrowed into caution, then resistance, as people recognized the pattern behind the arrivals: not partnership but control, and a plan to replace their laws, labor, and beliefs. Across Hispaniola and Cuba, the early encounters turned from wonder to confusion. Spanish demands for tribute and service clashed with Taíno principles of shared labor and collective land. Villages that once greeted explorers with song now faced soldiers enforcing quotas of gold and cotton. The people began hiding their stores and evacuating coastal towns under nightfall. Chiefs who questioned these commands were seized or executed as examples. The message became clear: obedience or punishment. Spanish forts rose near freshwater streams, and local families were forced to haul stones for their construction. Ceremonial centres lost their rhythm of festivals and harvest dances, replaced by fear of sudden raids. Smoke columns from burning villages marked where resistance had begun. Yet, even under occupation, communities preserved fragments of independence, shifting rituals deeper inland, storing food in mountain caves, and guiding children away from coastal missions. Every small act of avoidance became an act of defiance. What began as hospitality evolved into quiet rebellion, born not from hatred but from the instinct to remain free within their own land. The Caribbean, once open to trade winds and friendship, was now learning the cost of contact. By 1511, Spanish rule had turned labour into control through the encomienda system, a structure claiming to protect and teach, while forcing entire villages into endless work. Men were ordered to mine rivers for gold dust, women to grind cassava for colonial kitchens, and children carried water under a guard. Priests described it as salvation through toil, but for the Taíno it was enslavement masked as faith. Some families fled into mountain forests, forming hidden settlements beyond Spanish patrols. Others sabotaged shipments, broke iron tools, or misdirected supply canoes along the coast. Whispered networks of messengers passed between islands, warning what awaited any village that submitted. Among them rose the story of Hatue, a chief from Hispaniola who fled to Cuba, gathering warriors to resist the Spaniards. Captured after months of pursuit, he was offered baptism before execution. His answer silenced the priest. If heaven was where Spaniards went, he would rather go to hell. The flames that consumed him lit more than his pyre. They marked the first defiant rejection of conquest, a voice choosing death over surrender, a declaration that the soul of his people would never kneel. After Hatue's death, Spanish forces pushed deeper into the islands, believing that terror would force obedience. Yet defiance spread in silence. Villages once recorded as pacified slipped into the forest interior. Patrols returned to empty gardens and cold ashes, finding only footprints washed by rain. Women carried seeds, carvings, and ancestral stones to hidden valleys where new settlements rose. Elders retold Hatue's words around night fires, teaching that freedom could exist without victory. Captured guides misled their overseers, sending expeditions toward reefs and marshes. By 1515, governors complained that workers escaped faster than they could be replaced. Reports of extinction were deceptions of paper. Families were alive beneath the canopy, fishing by moonlight and trading by whisper. They turned wilderness into a shield, paths into messages, and songs into warnings. This migration became the first map of resistance in the New World, drawn not with ink but with footsteps. The white man's world ended where the jungle began. Among the trees children grew, hearing that no chain could bind the spirit. The islands that once welcomed visitors had become fortresses of memory, and every hidden village was a promise that their way of life would not be forgotten. By the 1520s, the Taíno world was scarred yet enduring. Spanish towns clung to the coast, guarded by walls and disease, while inland valleys still beat with native life. Survivors joined escaped Africans and refugees from neighbouring islands, forming new families that mixed languages and bloodlines. They traded silently along rivers, bartering fruit, salt, and iron fragments for news. Drums echoed through the trees, calling to sky and sea gods the colonists could not erase. Each beat was a statement of existence. Spanish records claimed the Indians were gone, yet petitions soon complained that the Indians hide themselves rather than serve. That sentence proved what numbers could not. The spirit survived. Across ridges and coves they fished, farmed, and raised children without permission. Faith remained in songs and midnight offerings. The Caribbean had changed from a gateway to empire into the birthplace of rejection. From these islands, the idea of living free beyond the white man's order would sail north and west, carried in canoes and memory. The first rejection was not a battle won by arms, but a decision to endure, to refuse erasure, and to teach each generation that survival itself was a victory no empire could claim. In the 17th century, new ships landed not on tropical islands, but along the colder, forested coasts of Virginia and New England. Here, English settlers built wooden palisades beside rivers claimed by the Powhatan Confederacy. At first, exchanges mirrored the old Caribbean pattern, corn for iron tools, furs for beads, but distrust grew quickly. Powhatan leaders understood that the English were not travellers, but builders of a foreign world. When John Smith demanded grain and allegiance, Chief Powhatan replied that he did not need to worship a strange god or surrender his country. "Your coming is not for trade, but to invade my people and possess my land," he warned. Villages fortified themselves behind earthen walls, watching musket smoke drift over fields. English preachers followed soldiers, offering salvation in the same breath as submission. Yet the people of the forest measured strength differently. They valued balance with the rivers and the hunt, not the rule of one man over another. While colonists saw wilderness to conquer, the Powhatan saw a homeland to defend, and with quiet precision they began to withdraw from the edges of every fort, leaving the invaders surrounded by the forest they misunderstood. Farther north, the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pequot nations watched the same pattern unfold. English colonies expanded, claiming fields and naming rivers already known to generations. At first, alliances formed through trade and necessity. Native hunters guided settlers through marsh and snow, teaching them to survive the winters. But behind every trade agreement came pressure to accept new faith, abandon ceremonies, and sign papers written in a language of ownership. Missionaries built meeting houses beside villages and called them praying towns, where conversion meant obedience. Some families entered seeking peace, others refused and retreated inland. Leaders saw how the colonists' fences divided not just land but spirit, turning shared earth into property. The Wampanoag Sachem Massasoit maintained balance through cautious diplomacy, but younger warriors grew restless under constant deceit. Rumours spread that the English planned to seize more ground once harvest ended. Across the forests, quiet councils gathered at night, deciding when coexistence would end. The first sparks of resistance were not in battle cries, but in silence, in the refusal to kneel, to farm the English way, or to pray under another's god. The forests still spoke in their own tongue, and the people chose to listen. By the mid-1600s, tension had turned into open conflict. The Pequot War erupted when English settlers, demanding control of trade routes and territory, attacked river villages in Connecticut. Armed with matchlock guns and steel blades, they burned palisaded towns before dawn, killing families who had offered peace the season before. Survivors fled toward Narragansett lands, only to be pursued again. The brutality shocked even other tribes, convincing many that negotiation meant nothing once the English wanted land. Yet amid loss, resistance adapted. Warriors used the forest as armour, striking in ambush, vanishing through wetlands, and avoiding the rigid field tactics the colonists relied on. Women and elders carried children north through swamp trails, building new camps among reeds and pine. In every retreated step there was strategy. To survive was to continue opposing. English leaders declared victory, but the land beyond their fences remained untamed, full of unseen eyes and footsteps. Each burned village became a memory etched into the soil, a warning passed down in winter lodges. The war ended in paper treaties, but beneath them lived an older promise, that the people of the eastern woodlands would endure as long as the forest did. After the Pequot War, colonists rebuilt confidence and expanded again, founding towns along riverbanks once lined with native fishing camps. English farms spread outward in neat rows, erasing hunting grounds and sacred groves. Missionaries returned, convinced that salvation required labour and farming. They called communal fields civilized work, and demanded native men abandon hunting. Many refused, seeing it as surrender to dependence. Women who once controlled planting seasons resisted church orders that denied their authority. In villages farther inland, councils warned that every acceptance of the colonists' faith invited their rule. When English officials summoned sachems to sign new treaties, many arrived, listened, and left without marking the page. Those who signed were often misled by translators, their promises twisted into deeds of sale. The forest people learned that the written word could be a weapon sharper than steel. Across Massachusetts and Connecticut, quiet discontent hardened into resolve. By the time King Philip, Metacom, son of Massasoit, rose to leadership, every broken agreement had built a single lesson, that coexistence meant disappearance. The coming rebellion would not begin from ambition, but from the refusal to vanish peacefully into another world's design. In 1675, Metacom's resolve ignited the conflict the English called King Philip's War. It began with scattered attacks on frontier settlements, sparked by arrests and executions of native leaders accused of rebellion. What followed was not chaos, but calculated retaliation. Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett warriors struck mills, bridges, and supply lines, moving swiftly through terrain they knew by heart. Colonists burned villages in response, unable to distinguish enemy from neighbour. Winter brought famine to both sides, yet the native resistance endured longer than expected. Forests shielded the movements of warriors. Frozen rivers became silent roads. Though Metacom was eventually hunted down and killed, his stand became legend, the moment when eastern tribes chose death over submission. English settlement survived, but victory came hollow. Hundreds of towns lay in ashes, and the colonists learned that conquest would always come at a price. For the native nations, survival remained the deeper triumph. Even in defeat, their refusal to yield preserved the spirit that connected them to the land. When peace returned, the forests still whispered their truth, that no empire could silence the heartbeat of those who remembered what freedom once sounded like beneath the trees. By the 1700s, European colonies had crossed the mountains and pressed into the Great Lakes and Plains, bringing traders, missionaries, and forts into lands long held by the Ojibwe, Cheyenne, and Lakota. The frontier was no longer a distant rumour. It was at the edges of every hunting ground. French and British envoys promised alliances through gifts, flags, and rum, each seeking loyalty in the contest for empire. Yet the tribes saw little difference between them. Both carried the same hunger for land and conversion. Among the Ojibwe, missionaries preached against the drum and the pipe, calling them tools of darkness. Chiefs listened politely, then continued their songs. The Cheyenne refused to plough the prairie, calling it the breaking of Mother Earth. To the Lakota, the idea of fenced property was unthinkable. Each effort to civilize was answered with quiet dismissal. Across the forests and plains, small acts of refusal formed a growing pattern. Traders turned away, priests left unwelcome, forts isolated. The frontier, meant to be the edge of European power, became instead a border of resistance, where the native nation stood between two worlds and began to define the limits of what they would not accept. By mid-century, European wars reached deep into native territories. The British and French fought for control of rivers and fur routes, each arming tribes as allies while spreading the same colonies behind them. The Iroquois Confederacy navigated this rivalry with skill, trading diplomacy for survival. Yet beneath the shifting politics, resentment grew. Forts rose on hunting lands, and missionary chapels stood where councils once met. For many, the contest between France and Britain meant little compared to the threat both posed to native independence. Pontiac, an Ottawa war leader, emerged as a voice of unity. He warned that the Europeans would never stop until every river and trail bore their mark. His call spread through the Great Lakes, urging tribes to return to their old ways, reject European goods, and fight for balance. In 1763, the uprising that followed, later called Pontiac's Rebellion, burned forts, seized posts, and briefly pushed the British back. To the colonists it was revolt, to the tribes, restoration. The rebellion marked not merely anger at injustice, but a declaration that the forest, the plains, and the spirit of the people still belonged to themselves alone. Pontiac's movement was more than war. It was a gathering of memory. Across the Great Lakes, council fires united nations that had once fought each other. Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Miami, and Shawnee, all agreeing that peace with the British meant slavery to trade and law. Warriors painted their faces in earth colours, carrying bows, muskets, and belief in the spirits of their ancestors. Fort after fort fell in sudden assaults, led not by armies but by coordinated tribal bands striking from the forests. British garrisons, expecting surrender, found themselves surrounded by people they thought divided. For a season, it seemed the frontier might collapse. Yet as winter came, hunger and lack of powder weakened the Confederation. The British counterattacked, burning villages and crops. Still, even when Pontiac sought peace, his message did not fade. It remained in the hearts of younger leaders who saw that the fight was never just against armies, but against a way of life that demanded obedience. The rebellion ended, but its spirit endured, proof that even when outnumbered and outgunned, unity could still challenge empire, and belief in freedom could outlast the sound of muskets. After Pontiac's rebellion, the British declared new borders meant to separate colonists from native lands, a line drawn on maps but ignored in practice. Settlers kept moving west, cutting forests, fencing fields, and driving game away. Missionaries returned, preaching that peace required farming, schooling, and conversion. Yet many tribes refused the plough, believing that turning the soil for profit was a betrayal of balance. Among the Great Plains, the Lakota and Cheyenne still followed the bison, moving with the seasons, trusting the rhythm of migration over the promise of stability. They traded with Europeans only on their own terms, exchanging hides for metal tools but rejecting church and school. To them, the prairies were sacred libraries, each trail a story, each hill a spirit. When soldiers asked them to settle, their leaders answered that a people who stop moving cease to live. Though treaties and maps multiplied, the plains remained free under open sky, guarded not by walls but by distance, will, and the knowledge that belonging could not be purchased, divided, or taught by strangers. By the late 18th century, European rule stretched from coast to coast, but its control was surface deep. The forest and prairie nations had learned how to resist without empire, government, or city, through endurance. They moved camps with the herds, rebuilt lodges after raids, and passed stories through generations to explain why the land could never truly belong to one ruler. The Ojibwe kept their ceremonies alive beside the Great Lakes. The Lakota rode the plains with the same freedom their ancestors had known before the first fort. Traders came and went, but the nations remained. What the colonists saw as wilderness was to them home and scripture. When surveyors measured land by chains and compasses, they measured nothing of its meaning. The 18th century closed with empires celebrating victory, unaware that their maps described only roads and rivers, not the spirit that still lived between them. The native nations had not been conquered. They had adapted, withdrawn, and waited. The white man's world believed it had triumphed, but across the frontier, under the same sun, the land still spoke the language of those who refused to be remade. By the early 19th century, the frontier had shifted again. The United States now stood where empires once fought, carrying forward the same vision of expansion dressed in new language. Progress, settlement, civilization. Across the plains and valleys, soldiers mapped routes, missionaries built schools, and government agents offered treaties that promised peace, but required surrender. The Lakota, Shawnee, and Nez Perce listened carefully, recognizing old lies behind new words. Chief Tecumseh of the Shawnee spoke across villages, urging unity before the land vanished entirely. "The Great Spirit gave this land to all," he said, "not to be sold or divided." His message spread like wildfire through the Ohio Valley and beyond. Tribes that had long stood apart began to share scouts, food, and warnings. It was not rebellion for conquest, but for continuity, the defense of what remained whole. When settlers built roads through hunting grounds, resistance followed in quiet strikes and burned outposts. For every treaty signed, another camp disappeared into the trees. The government called it unrest, the people called it survival. The old frontier was closing, but its defenders refused to step aside, holding fast to the promise that freedom could not be legislated away. Further west, the Nez Perce and Lakota faced the same pressure through missionary civilization programs. Agents distributed plows, livestock, and printed Bibles, expecting gratitude. Instead, they met polite refusal. The Nez Perce leaders insisted that their children would not learn from men who denied the Creator's design. Among the Lakota, Sitting Bull warned that white education would teach dependence instead of wisdom. He refused to farm or move into fixed houses, saying the earth was already his home and the plains his school. US officers labelled him a troublemaker, yet his calm defiance drew admiration even from enemies. Across reservations, tribal councils debated how long peace could survive when peace meant obedience. Many continued to trade, hunt, and hold ceremonies in secret, knowing that open defiance brought soldiers. But every hidden drumbeat was resistance. Each dance and prayer reminded them of who they were before borders. To the officials in Washington, these nations seemed subdued. In truth, they were enduring beneath the surface, guarding their identity the way a flame survives inside ash, unseen but alive, waiting for the wind to rise again. The next generation would inherit that endurance and carry it into a darker century. By the 1870s, the United States turned resistance into policy. The Indian agents managed every ration and movement, while soldiers enforced relocation to reservation boundaries. Tribal independence was reduced to signatures and permissions. Yet within these boundaries, identity endured. Among the northern plains, the Lakota gathered at the Powder River and refused to abandon the buffalo ranges. They called it the last free ground. The army called it defiance. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led bands that ignored orders to move, believing the Creator had not drawn lines across the prairie. Each skirmish, each retreat, became part of a larger truth, that a people could not be confined by fences. The Great Sioux War began when gold seekers entered the Black Hills, a sacred place never sold. Even under cannon fire, warriors rode bareback across open grass, fighting for the right to remain themselves. When the army triumphed on paper, the spirit of defiance continued in song, in language, and in the names passed down to children. The government declared victory, but the victory could not reach the heart of a people who still saw the horizon as their measure of freedom. As the reservation system tightened, reformers arrived claiming to save what conquest had nearly erased. They called it the civilizing mission. Churches built schools, taught English, and cut children's hair to erase tradition. Elders were forbidden to perform ceremonies or speak the old tongues. Yet within every classroom, quiet rebellion took root. Children whispered their real names to each other after dark. Mothers carved tribal patterns into clothing hidden beneath uniforms. Every forbidden story retold at night was an act of defiance. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce embodied that same endurance when his people were ordered to move to Idaho. Refusing to abandon their homeland, they began a 1,000-mile flight through mountains and rivers, chased by soldiers. For months they evaded capture with skill that stunned the army. When finally surrounded, Joseph's surrender was not defeat but exhaustion. "I will fight no more forever," he said, words that mourned lives lost, not faith broken. To those who heard them, the statement was a promise that survival, not submission, would define the future. The schools and borders would stand, but the spirit would never be taught away. By the late 1880s, pressure turned spiritual. Missionaries urged conversion, reformers promoted farming, and the US divided reservations into private plots under the Dawes Act. Each family received a fraction of land, the rest sold to settlers. The policy was meant to dissolve tribal unity, yet it birthed a new form of rejection. Across the plains and the Great Basin, a message spread, a vision that the old world could return if the people came together in faith and dance. The ghost dance movement began among the Paiute and reached the Lakota within a year. They danced for renewal, for the buffalo's return, for a sky free of soldiers. To Washington, it looked like rebellion. Troops were sent to suppress it, leading to tragedy at Wounded Knee. But even there, amid loss, the meaning endured. The ghost dance was not an illusion of escape. It was a declaration that the white man's world could never own the native soul. Though the guns fell silent, the rhythm carried forward, a heartbeat echoing through generations, reminding each tribe that belief, once awakened, cannot be conquered. The body may yield, but the spirit remembers its own horizon. When the guns of Wounded Knee fell silent in 1890, many outside the plains believed the native world had ended. Newspapers called it the close of the frontier, the final chapter of resistance. But within the camps and reservations, something deeper stirred. A resolve that survival itself was victory. The ghost dance had been silenced by bullets, yet its rhythm continued in whispers, footsteps, and dreams. Elders spoke of the circle that could never be broken, of ancestors who watched from beyond the horizon. Across the Dakota Plains, survivors gathered to mourn, not as a conquered people but as witnesses. They buried their dead, repaired their lodges, and sang softly to the wind that carried their prayers. Children who had seen the soldiers' guns now heard stories of what freedom once felt like beneath the open sky. To the government they were subjects. To themselves they were keepers of the old fire. The war for land was lost, but the war for memory had begun. Out of grief rose determination, a quiet promise that even if the world changed, the heart of the people would remain, beating like the drums once banned yet never forgotten. In the years that followed, native nations across the continent faced the hard reality of confinement. Reservations stretched wide in name but narrow in freedom. Agents counted every tool, measured every harvest, and dictated when children would attend the new schools. Yet within this system, resilience found hidden paths. Families planted corn beside agency fields without permission. Women taught songs and languages beneath the sound of church bells. Warriors, forbidden to ride in full regalia, still wore feathers under coats when they hunted. Every act, however small, carried the weight of defiance. Across tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, and Hopi, the same idea endured, that identity could survive even behind fences. As decades passed, the old stories blended with new ones, shaping a language of endurance that no policy could erase. Elders gathered their grandchildren around fires, telling them that strength was not in revenge, but in remembrance. The white man's world controlled borders and schools, but not hearts. The people learned to fight in silence, with memory as their weapon, passing down the belief that every sunrise over their land was proof. The spirit of the old world still breathed beneath modern names. By the early 20th century, reformers claimed that native people were becoming civilized, yet the truth lay in quiet endurance. Boarding schools produced students who spoke English, but remembered their languages in secret. Some returned as interpreters, using the colonizers' words to defend their tribes in courts and councils. The same laws meant to erase identity became tools to protect it. On reservations, communal dances reappeared disguised as harvest festivals. Ceremonial clothing once banned was worn again during fairs that officials attended without understanding their meaning. In the Dakotas, elders told how the ghost dance had not died. It had simply changed rhythm. Its message carried now in the will to survive with dignity. Across generations, music and story replaced weapons. The battles of the future would not be fought on horseback, but in classrooms, protests, and speeches. A new kind of warrior emerged, one who resisted through knowledge. Even as roads and towns spread across old hunting grounds, the memory of what once was remained sharp. A compass pointing backward and forward at once. The people had not disappeared. They had transformed, keeping the heart of their nations alive beneath the surface of a changing world. By mid-century, native voices began to rise again in public, echoing the courage of earlier leaders. Veterans returning from 2 world wars demanded the same freedom they had fought to defend overseas. Tribal councils reformed, elders reclaimed languages for new generations, and activists carried the message of self-determination into cities. The drum circles, once forbidden, returned openly in gatherings that blended tradition with modern life. Across reservations, communities revived crafts, songs, and ceremonies long suppressed. The spirit of rejection had evolved into reclamation. No longer content to hide, they declared that survival was not enough. They would live as native people on their own terms. From the Lakota plains to the Navajo deserts, voices spoke the same truth. The land could still remember them. What began centuries earlier with defiance at the shore and forest had become a movement for renewal. The white man's world had offered religion, law, and schools. Now the native nations answered with identity, unity, and pride. The ancient circle of resistance had never broken, it had simply widened to include the living. Today, that legacy endures. The descendants of those who rejected the white man's world continue to walk two paths, one shaped by modern life, the other guided by ancestral wisdom. Powwows echo across the plains. Languages once whispered are taught again in classrooms, and sacred fires burn at gatherings that welcome every tribe. The same sun that rose over Taíno shores and Powhatan forests now rises over reservations and cities where native identity thrives. Their story is not tragedy but return, proof that culture can outlast conquest. Every drumbeat recalls Hattue's defiance, Tecumseh's unity, Sitting Bull's strength, and the songs of the ghost dance. The world around them changed, yet their core remained unbroken. For those who listen, history speaks clearly. The rejection of domination was never the end. It was the beginning of remembrance. And if you're hearing this story now, know that it lives because they refuse to forget. The white man's world may have built its borders, but the spirit of the First Nations still moves freely, across time, across generations, and across every place where the wind still carries their names. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.